They sold her for $12 and a mule, and by sundown, not a single man in that town could meet her eyes. The wagon wheels groaned to a stop in front of the trading post, dust curling low across the ground like something that didn't want to be seen. And when the driver pulled back the canvas, she didn't step down right away, not because she was afraid, but because she understood what waited below, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full of judgment, of laughter held just behind teeth. Someone in the crowd spat into the dirt. "That's the replacement," a man muttered, not even lowering his voice, and a few others chuckled, slow and careless, like they had all the time in the world to decide what she was worth. A thin piece of paper fluttered from the driver's hand, pinned under a rock near her boots. $12 and one mule, written in uneven ink that had bled into the fibers like it didn't quite believe itself. She saw it. Everyone did. That was the point. The humiliation wasn't hidden. It was displayed, measured, agreed upon. The quiet rancher stood a little apart from the others, hat low, shoulders still, not leaning, not shifting, not joining in the low hum of voices that passed for entertainment out here. Elias Whitmore didn't step forward when they called his name, didn't reach up to help her down. He just looked, and there was something in that look that didn't match the number on the paper. The driver cleared his throat, impatient. "She's all that's left," he said, like he was apologizing for a broken tool, not a person standing barefoot on splintered wood. Other girl ran off before sunrise. "This one she'll do." More laughter, softer now, almost relieved. The kind of laughter men use when they want to believe something easy. She climbed down on her own, slow, steady, the boards creaking under her weight, and when her boots touched the ground, the dust rose around her ankles like it was trying to hide her from them, or maybe from what came next. No one offered a hand. No one asked her name. They already had something better, a price. Elias stepped forward then, not fast, not slow, just enough to close the distance. And for a moment the noise thinned, like even the wind had decided to listen. The driver held out the paper, tapping the number with a finger that smelled like tobacco and old deals. "You paid," he said. "She's yours." Elias didn't take the paper, didn't even look at it. His eyes stayed on her face, not searching, not claiming, just seeing, in a way that made her straighten slightly without meaning to. A pause stretched there, thin as a wire. Then he reached past the paper, past the driver, and picked up the small bundle at her feet instead, a worn piece of cloth tied at the corners, light enough to carry, heavy enough to matter. He held it for a second, weighing something no one else could see, then turned toward the open road without a word. The driver blinked. "You don't want the receipt?" Elias shook his head once. "Don't need it." The men behind him shifted, some smirking, some confused, but none stepping forward, none laughing now, because something had changed, not loud, not obvious, just enough to unsettle the air. She hesitated only a heartbeat before following, her steps quiet against the dirt, the paper still pinned under the rock, still shouting its number to anyone who cared to look. Behind them, someone muttered, $12, like it was a joke that had lost its punchline. Ahead of them, the land stretched wide and empty, the kind of empty that didn't forgive mistakes, and Elias didn't look back, not at the town, not at the paper, not at the men who had already decided what she was worth. He just walked, steady as a man who had made a choice without saying it out loud. And for the first time since the wagon stopped, she lifted her eyes from the ground and watched him, not with hope, not yet, but with something quieter, something that had been buried under dust and numbers and other people's voices, something that didn't have a price written on it. The road stretched out ahead in a long ribbon of pale dust, winding past dry grass and broken fence posts that leaned like tired men, and neither of them spoke for the first mile, not because there was nothing to say, but because words out here had a way of costing more than they were worth. Elias walked a few steps ahead, the small cloth bundle resting in his hand, his stride steady, unhurried, as if he had already measured the distance to his ranch down to the last foot, and behind him she followed without dragging her boots, without rushing either, keeping the same quiet rhythm, the kind that did not ask permission and did not offer apology. The wind shifted once, carrying the faint scent of leather and sun-baked wood from the direction of his land, and she noticed the way he tilted his head slightly, not turning, just listening, as if the place itself was speaking to him from miles away. After another stretch of silence, he stopped near a weathered post where a rope hung loose, swaying gently, and set her bundle on top of it before stepping back, giving her space, like it was something he understood without needing to explain. "Water's about a quarter-mile that way," he said, his voice low, even, pointing toward a narrow line of green that cut through the dry land like a promise that had not been broken yet. "Spring runs shallow, but it is clean." She looked at the direction he pointed, then back at him, her eyes steady, searching for something beneath the surface of his words, but he had already turned slightly, not away from her, just enough to show he was not watching, not waiting for thanks, not expecting anything in return. She picked up the bundle, her fingers brushing the worn fabric, and walked toward the spring without another word, her steps light but certain, as if she had walked land like this before, as if the earth itself did not feel strange beneath her feet. Elias remained where he was, one hand resting on the fence post, eyes scanning the horizon in that slow, careful way of a man who knew that trouble did not always arrive loud. And after a moment he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small coin, turning it once between his fingers before letting it fall back into the fabric, untouched, like he had already decided it did not belong to him anymore. When she returned, the dust on her boots darker now from the damp ground. He had already untied his horse from a nearby rail, the animal shifting its weight with a soft snort, ears flicking toward her as she approached, not skittish, not overly curious, just aware. Elias took the bundle again without brushing her hand, securing it behind the saddle with practiced ease, then stepped aside, leaving the space open between them, not inviting, not refusing, just there. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then placed her foot in the stirrup and mounted in one smooth motion, her posture straight, balanced, the kind that did not come from learning in a hurry, but from knowing something long before this day. Elias noticed. He did not say it, but it settled somewhere behind his eyes, quiet and deliberate. He took the reins and began to lead the horse forward, not riding, not yet, choosing instead to walk beside it, his pace unchanged, his presence steady. And as they moved further from the town, the noise of it faded completely, leaving only the sound of wind brushing through dry grass and the faint creak of leather with each step. Behind them, that piece of paper still lay pinned under the rock, still claiming its number to anyone who cared to believe it. But out here, where the land stretched wider than any man's judgment, its value had already begun to disappear, carried off in pieces by the same wind that now followed quietly at their backs. By the time the ranch came into view, the sun had shifted west, laying long shadows across the land like quiet warnings, and the house stood alone against the open sky, its wood faded by years of wind and heat, not broken, not abandoned, just unchanged, like the man who lived there. A narrow fence line marked the boundary, more suggestion than barrier, and the gate hung slightly crooked, creaking as Elias pushed it open with one hand, the sound stretching out into the still air before settling into silence again. He did not announce their arrival, did not call out to anyone. There was no one to call. He led the horse through, closing the gate behind them with a careful push, making sure it caught, a small habit that spoke of order, of things being done the same way every time. The yard was clean in the way that comes from routine, not effort, tools set where they belonged, a water trough half full, a stack of cut wood leaning neatly against the side of the house, and she noticed all of it without turning her head too much, taking it in piece by piece, the way someone does when they understand that every detail carries meaning. Elias stopped near the hitching post and secured the reins, his movements quiet, efficient, then stepped back again, leaving space between them as he had before, never close enough to crowd, never far enough to disappear. She slid down from the saddle, boots touching the packed dirt with a soft thud, and for a moment she simply stood there, not uncertain, not lost, just measuring the place, the distance between the door and the well, the angle of the sun against the porch, the way the wind moved around the corners of the building like it had memorized the shape. Elias reached behind the saddle and untied her bundle, holding it out without looking directly at her, his gaze fixed somewhere just past her shoulder. "Inside is clean," he said, voice steady, like he was stating a fact that did not need to be questioned. "Water barrels filled. Food's on the table. You can use what you need." He paused, not searching for the right words, just letting the sentence end where it felt honest. She took the bundle, her fingers brushing the worn cloth again, and this time she noticed something else, the faint glint of silver tucked beneath the fold, a chain barely visible where the fabric had loosened. Elias saw it too, just for a second, the light catching his eye before he looked away, not asking, not reaching, but the image stayed with him, quiet and unresolved. She turned toward the house, her steps unhurried, and when she reached the door, she rested her hand against the wood for a moment, feeling the warmth of the sun still held in it, as if the place itself had been waiting, not for her, but for someone. The door opened with a soft push, hinges whispering rather than protesting, and she stepped inside without looking back. Elias remained where he was, standing in the yard with the kind of stillness that does not come from hesitation but from attention, listening to the faint sounds from within, the shift of footsteps, the creak of floorboards, the quiet movement of someone entering a space that had belonged to one man for too long. He exhaled slowly, almost unnoticed, and reached up to adjust his hat, his fingers pausing for a brief second at the brim before dropping. Back to his side. The wind moved again, brushing past him, carrying the scent of dust, and something softer now, something new, and he turned his head slightly toward the house, not enough to be seen, just enough to acknowledge that the silence had changed, not broken, not replaced, but altered in a way that could not be undone. Inside, she set the bundle down on the table, the cloth loosening just enough for the silver chain to slip free, catching the fading light from the window, and for a moment she held it in her hand, the cool metal resting against her palm, before closing her fingers around it again, not hiding it, not showing it, just keeping it where it belonged, close enough to remember, far enough to remain unseen. Morning came without announcement, just a thin line of pale light slipping through the cracks of the wooden walls, stretching slowly across the floor until it reached the table where the silver chain lay coiled beside the folded cloth, and she was already awake when it touched her hand, her eyes open, steady, as if sleep had only been a pause rather than a rest. Outside, Elias moved before the sun fully cleared the horizon, the soft rhythm of his boots against the dirt, the quiet clink of metal as he checked the trough, the low murmur he gave the horse that was more habit than conversation, and he did not look toward the house. Not yet, not because he did not think of it, but because he knew better than to rush what had just begun. Inside, she rose without sound, her movements measured, not careful in fear but deliberate in purpose, and she gathered the chain in her hand for a moment before slipping it beneath her collar, hidden again, close to her skin where it belonged, then turned her attention to the room, not as a guest would, not as someone passing through, but as someone deciding what needed to be done. The water barrel stood near the wall, filled but ringed with dust, the table held food but no order, the floor clean but not kept, and she moved through each space without hesitation, lifting, adjusting, setting things right in small ways that did not call attention to themselves, the kind of changes that only someone who lived there would notice later. When she stepped outside, the air carried the faint chill of early morning, and Elias paused for the first time, not turning fully, just enough to acknowledge her presence without breaking the quiet that had settled between them. She walked past him without waiting, heading toward the horse, her eyes scanning its posture, the slight shift in weight on its left side, the way its ear flicked back more often than forward, and she stopped beside it, her hand hovering just above its shoulder before resting there lightly, not claiming, not forcing, just listening through touch. Elias watched from a distance, his gaze narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition of something he had not expected to see. She moved along the horse's side, her fingers tracing the line of muscle until they paused near the lower leg, and she crouched, brushing away a thin layer of dirt to reveal a small swelling, not fresh, not severe, but enough to trouble the animal over time. She did not call out, did not ask. She simply stood, walked to the edge of the yard, and knelt near a cluster of low green plants that grew stubbornly between stones, her hands gathering a few leaves with care, not tearing, not rushing, then returning to the horse with the same quiet certainty. Elias stepped closer now, not interrupting, just watching, his arms resting loosely at his sides, as she crushed the leaves between her fingers, releasing a sharp, clean scent into the air, and pressed them gently against the swelling, her touch steady, practiced, as if this was something she had done many times before, something taught, not guessed. The horse shifted once, then stilled, its breathing easing, and Elias exhaled slowly, the sound barely there, but enough to mark the moment. "You've done that before," he said, his voice low, not a question, not quite a statement. She did not look up right away, her focus still on the horse, her hand resting lightly where she had placed the leaves, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same quiet weight as his. "It will walk better by evening," she said, not explaining, not offering more than what was needed. Elias nodded once, slow, absorbing the words, the action, the way she had moved through it all without hesitation, without asking permission, and something shifted again, small but certain, like a piece of a puzzle falling into place where he had not known there was a gap. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, the land stretching wide and familiar, and for the first time since he had brought her here, he realized that what he had taken for silence was not emptiness, but presence, quiet, steady, and impossible to ignore. The sun climbed higher, pressing heat into the earth until the air itself seemed to slow, and by mid-morning the quiet of the ranch had settled into something steady, something lived in, but not untouched, not anymore. And Elias found himself noticing things he had long stopped seeing. The way the bucket sat straighter beside the well, the way the tools leaned not just where they had been dropped, but where they made sense. And it was not the kind of order that demanded attention, it was the kind that revealed itself only if you knew how things used to be. He stood near the fence line, one hand resting on the wood, watching her from a distance as she moved through the yard, not wandering, not unsure, but working without being told, adjusting what needed adjusting, leaving alone what already held its place, and there was no show in it, no effort to be seen, just quiet intention in every motion. The horse shifted nearby, testing its weight, and for the first time in days it did not hesitate, its step more certain, and Elias caught that too, not with surprise, but with a slow acknowledgement that settled deeper than words. The sound of distant hooves broke the stillness sometime after noon, faint at first, then clearer, rolling across the land in a rhythm that did not belong to him, and Elias turned his head slightly, eyes narrowing toward the horizon where a thin line of dust began to rise, not large, not urgent, but enough to signal company. She heard it too, her hands stilled where she stood near the water trough, her head lifting just a fraction, listening, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the space between them holding the same quiet understanding that had grown since morning. The riders came into view slowly, two figures against the light, their pace easy but purposeful, and as they drew closer, the shape of them became familiar in a way that did not bring comfort, not quite. Elias stepped forward a few feet, not to block, not to welcome, just to meet them where the land felt neutral, his posture relaxed but grounded, the kind of stance that did not invite trouble and did not step away from it either. The first rider tipped his hat back as he approached, a thin smile stretching across his face, the kind that carried more judgment than greeting. "Whitmore," he called out, voice carrying easily in the dry air. "Heard you finally settled for less." The second man chuckled behind him, slower, heavier, letting the words hang longer than they needed to, and their eyes shifted past Elias toward the yard, toward her, measuring, assessing, the same way the crowd had done the day before, only quieter now, more deliberate. Elias did not turn to follow their gaze. "What you heard ain't your concern," he said, his voice even, not raised, not sharpened, just placed where it needed to be. The first man leaned slightly in his saddle, studying him, then glanced again toward her, his expression unreadable for a moment before settling back into that thin smile. $12, he said softly, almost to himself, like he was testing the number, seeing if it still held weight out here. Behind Elias, she had not moved closer, had not stepped back. She stood where she was, her posture straight, her eyes calm, not challenging, not yielding, just present, and there was something in that stillness that did not match the number spoken aloud. Elias shifted his weight once, just enough to ground himself, his hand brushing lightly against the fence post beside him. "Price was never the point," he said, quiet enough that the wind nearly took it, but steady enough that both men heard it clearly. The second rider's chuckle faded, replaced by a brief silence that stretched thinner than before, and for a moment, None of them spoke, the air holding that tension not of threat, but of something harder to name, something that did not belong to numbers or deals. Then the first man straightened in his saddle, tipping his hat again, this time without the same ease. "We will see about that," he said, turning his horse with a small pull of the reins, the dust rising once more as they began to ride off, their presence fading back into the distance as quickly as it had arrived. Elias remained where he was until the sound of hooves disappeared completely, his gaze fixed on the horizon a moment longer than necessary. Then he exhaled slowly and turned back toward the yard, toward her, and this time, when his eyes met hers, there was no question in them, only recognition, quiet and certain, that whatever had been brought here the day before was not something that could be measured, not by men, not by paper, and not by the kind of voices that faded as soon as they rode away. The afternoon settled heavy across the land, the kind of heat that pressed silence deeper into everything it touched, and for a long while after the riders disappeared, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the moment had already said enough. Elias moved first, not toward the house, not toward her, but toward the far edge of the fence where the posts dipped slightly into uneven ground, his boots slow, deliberate, each step measured like he was giving the land time to answer something only he could hear. She remained where she was, her eyes following him for a brief moment before shifting outward, toward the same horizon the riders had vanished into, her expression unchanged, but her stillness carrying a weight that had not been there before. The wind came in low, brushing through the dry grass, carrying with it a faint shift in scent, something older than dust, something that did not belong to the ranch, and her head tilted slightly, just enough to catch it more clearly. Elias noticed that too. Not the scent, but the way she responded to it, the subtle change in her posture, the way her shoulders set not in fear, not in readiness, but in recognition. He stopped walking, looked past the fence line. At first, there was nothing, just land and sky, stretched wide and empty. Then, slowly, shapes began to form against the far ridge, small at first, no more than shadows that moved where shadows should not. Then clearer, one becoming two becoming several, their outlines steady, deliberate, and unlike the careless approach of the riders from before, these figures did not rush, did not announce themselves with dust or noise. They simply appeared, as if they had always been there and were only now choosing to be seen. Elias stood still, his hand resting lightly on the fence post, his gaze fixed forward, not tense, not relaxed, just present. He did not reach for anything, did not step back. Behind him, she had not moved closer, but something in the air between them had shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a thread pulled tight without breaking. The figures on the ridge grew clearer as the light shifted, the sun lowering just enough to cast them in sharper relief, and now it was impossible to mistake them for anything else. Riders, more than a few, not scattered, not uncertain, aligned, watching. The distance held, not closing, not retreating, just enough to remain a presence without becoming a threat, and Elias understood that distance for what it was. Intentional, measured, a line drawn without words. He glanced back once, not fully turning, just enough to see her where she stood, and for the first time since she had arrived, her gaze was not on the ground, not on the work before her, but lifted, fixed on that distant ridge, her eyes steady, not surprised, not afraid, just aware. A quiet recognition passed between them, not spoken, not confirmed, but they're all the same. The horse shifted again near the trough, its ears flicking toward the ridge, then back toward her, then stilling, as if even the animal sensed that whatever had arrived carried a different kind of weight than the men who had come earlier. Elias exhaled slowly, the sound nearly lost in the wind, and leaned slightly into the fence post, grounding himself in something solid, something known, as his eyes returned to the distant line of riders. They did not move closer, did not call out. They simply remained, a silent presence against the fading light, and in that silence, something began to unfold, not in action, but in understanding, the kind that does not rush, does not demand, but settles in piece by piece until it can no longer be ignored. Behind him, she took a single step forward, not toward him, not toward the ridge, just enough to stand fully in the open, the light catching her face now, clear and unhidden, and for a brief moment, the distance between her and those figures felt smaller than the space between her and the rest of the world. Elias did not speak. Neither did she. And on that quiet stretch of land, under a sky that held more questions than answers, the truth began to take shape, not loud, not sudden, but steady, like something that had been waiting all along for the right moment to be seen. The light shifted again, softer now, stretching long across the ground as the sun began its slow descent, and the figures on the ridge remained exactly where they had been, unmoving, patient in a way that did not belong to men who came looking for something to take. Elias did not step forward, did not call out, because he understood that whatever this was, it was not meant to be rushed, not meant to be met halfway, and beside him, the silence held, not empty, but full of something that felt older than either of them. Then, without warning and without haste, one of the riders broke from the line, guiding his horse down the slope with a steady, deliberate pace, not fast enough to threaten, not slow enough to hesitate, just certain. And as he descended, the others did not follow. They simply watched, holding their place as if the distance itself was part of the message. The lone rider reached the flat of the land and continued forward until he stopped just beyond the fence, not crossing it, not testing it. Just there, his presence firm but contained, and for a moment he said nothing, his eyes moving first to Elias, then past him, settling on her with a stillness that carried recognition without surprise. Elias felt it, that shift, that quiet pull in the air, and he stepped slightly to the side, not stepping away, not stepping in front, just making space without announcing it. The rider dismounted slowly, his boots touching the ground without a sound that carried, and he removed his hat, holding it low at his side, his posture straight, his gaze steady, and when he spoke, his voice did not rise, did not demand, it simply reached across the space between them. "You have been gone longer than the seasons should allow," he said, his words directed not at Elias, but at her, and there was no accusation in them, only wait, the kind that comes from waiting without knowing if the waiting will end. She did not answer right away. Her eyes remained on him, calm, unwavering, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to that single line between them, the ranch, the fence, even Elias himself fading into the edges of something larger, something that had been set in motion long before this place had ever been built. The rider's gaze dropped briefly, just enough to notice the faint outline beneath her collar, the slight glint of silver where the light caught it, and when his eyes lifted again, there was no doubt left in them. "They searched," he continued, quieter now, "not to bring you back by force, but to understand why you left without word." The wind moved between them, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant earth, and she took a slow breath, not to steady herself, but to mark the moment, to acknowledge what had finally arrived. "Some paths are not meant to be followed," she said, her voice even, not distant, not cold, just certain, and the rider inclined his head slightly, not in agreement, but in respect for the answer he had been given. Behind him, on the ridge, the others remained still, their silhouettes unchanged, their presence quiet but undeniable, and Elias felt the weight of it now, not as a threat, not as a question, but as something that belonged to her in a way that nothing on his land ever could. He did not speak, did not ask. He simply stood where he was, his eyes moving from the rider to her and back again, understanding settling into him piece by piece, slow and steady, like the land itself revealing something it had kept hidden beneath the surface. The rider replaced his hat, his movements unhurried, and took a single step back, not turning yet, not leaving, just creating space where none had been before, and in that space, the truth stood clear, not spoken aloud, but impossible to ignore, that whatever she had been sold as, whatever number had been placed beside her name, it had never held the weight of who she truly was, and out here, where silence carried more meaning than words, that truth did not need to be declared, it only needed to be seen. The wind slowed as if the land itself was waiting, and for a long moment no one moved, not Elias, not the rider, not even the figures on the ridge, and in that stillness the distance between choice and consequence narrowed to something that could be crossed with a single step. The rider's gaze remained steady on her, not demanding, not pleading, just present, and the space he had left open in front of him felt deliberate, an invitation without words, a path that did not force but did not disappear either. Elias stood slightly behind and to the side, his posture unchanged, his hands resting at his sides, and if there was anything in him that wanted to speak, to ask, to claim, it did not show, because out here, some things were not his to decide. She looked at the rider, then past him, her eyes lifting toward the ridge where the others waited, silent and unmoving. And for the first time since they had appeared, the distance seemed to shift, not in miles, but in meaning, as if that place belonged to her in a way no one else could see. Her hand moved slowly to her collar, fingers slipping beneath the fabric until they found the silver chain, and she drew it out into the light, the small piece catching the fading sun, its surface worn but unmistakable, and when it rested against her palm, the air around them seemed to tighten, not in tension, but in recognition. The rider's head lowered slightly, not as submission, but as acknowledgement, and behind him, though they did not move, the figures on the ridge seemed to hold that same quiet respect, as if the object itself carried a story none of them needed to speak aloud. Elias watched without turning his head, his eyes fixed on that small glint of silver, understanding settling deeper into him now, not as surprise, but as confirmation of something he had already begun to see. She closed her fingers around the chain, holding it for a moment longer, then let it fall back against her chest, not hiding it, not offering it, just placing it where it belonged. The rider took a step back, creating more space, his hand resting lightly on the reins of his horse, waiting, not pressing, because whatever came next was not something that could be taken, only chosen. The silence stretched, thin but unbroken, and she turned then, not toward the ridge, not toward the rider, but toward the house, her steps slow, measured, each one carrying weight without hesitation. Elias did not move to meet her, did not step aside. He simply remained where he was, watching as she passed him, close enough that he could have reached out if he chose to. But he did not, because he understood now that whatever this was, it was not something to be held by force or by fear. She stopped near the door, her hand resting briefly against the wood again, the same way she had the day before, and for a moment she stood there, her back to both men, the land stretching out behind her in two directions, one known, one waiting. The rider remained still beyond the fence, his gaze fixed, his posture unchanged, and the figures on the ridge did not move, their presence steady, patient, like something that could wait as long as it needed to. Then, without turning back, she opened the door and stepped inside. The sound was soft, final in a way that did not need emphasis, and the door closed behind her with a quiet certainty that settled over the yard like dust after wind. Elias exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to be seen if someone knew where to look, and after a moment he stepped forward, not toward the rider, not toward the ridge, but toward the fence, his hand resting again on the worn wood as he looked out across the land. The rider watched him for a second, then gave a small nod, not to Elias, not exactly, but to the space itself, to what had just been decided without words, and with that, he turned, guiding his horse back the way he had come. On the ridge, the others shifted at last, their silhouettes breaking, then reforming as they turned away, their presence fading into the distance as quietly as it had appeared, leaving behind nothing but the wide, open land and the kind of silence that no longer felt empty, but full of something that had chosen to stay. The last of the dust settled long after the riders had disappeared, the ridge empty again, the horizon stretched clean and quiet as if nothing had ever stood there, and Elias remained by the fence a while longer, not because he expected them to return, but because something inside him needed time to follow what had already moved on. The light had softened into evening, gold turning slowly to amber, then to something deeper, and when he finally turned toward the house, the door stood closed the same way she had left it, plain, still, holding its silence like it meant something now. He stepped onto the porch without sound, his boots familiar against the wood, and paused just before the handle, not hesitating, just listening, the way he had learned to listen to the land, to the wind, to the quiet shifts that told more truth than words ever could. Inside, there was movement, small, steady, the kind that belonged, and when he opened the door, it did not feel like entering an empty place anymore. She stood by the table, the last light of the day slipping through the window and catching the edges of her silhouette, not hiding, not standing as a guest, but placed within the room like she had chosen her place in it. The bundle lay unfolded now, its worn cloth spread flat, and beside it the silver chain rested for a moment on the table, no longer concealed, no longer needing to be. Elias closed the door behind him with a soft push, the sound settling into the space between them, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke, not out of distance, but because nothing needed to be filled. He took a step forward, slow, steady, his eyes moving not to the chain, not to the bundle, but to her face, searching not for explanation, not for permission, just for truth, the kind that did not change depending on who asked. She met his gaze without lowering her eyes, without offering more than what was already there, and in that moment, the weight of everything that had come before settled into something simple, something clear. Elias reached into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing against the coin he had not used, the one that had once meant payment, possession, decision, and he held it for a second before placing it quietly on the table beside the silver chain, not as an exchange, not as a correction, just as something that no longer belonged in his hand. The metal made a soft sound against the wood, small but final, and he stepped back, giving the space back to her the same way he always had, never taking, never pressing, only standing where he was needed and nowhere else. She looked, down at the coin, then at the chain, her hand moving slowly between them, not choosing one over the other, but understanding both, and after a moment she lifted the chain, letting it rest again against her collar, the silver catching the last of the fading light before disappearing beneath the fabric. The coin remained where it was, untouched. Elias watched that, not with expectation, not with question, just with a quiet acceptance that settled deeper than anything spoken aloud. Outside, the wind moved gently against the walls, carrying the scent of dust and nightfall, and inside, the silence held, not empty, not uncertain, but full in a way that did not need to be named. He turned slightly, his hand resting on the back of a chair, his voice low when it came, steady, simple, as if it had been waiting for the right moment to exist. "You can stay," he said, not offering, not asking, just stating what had already become true. She did not answer right away, her eyes lifting from the table to meet his once more, and in that look there was no debt, no obligation, no trace of the number that had once defined her, only choice, quiet and certain. After a moment, she gave a small nod, not dramatic, not hesitant, just enough to be seen, and that was all. Elias did not smile, did not step closer. He simply nodded once in return, the motion slight but grounded, and turned toward the window, his gaze moving out across the land that had always been his, and now, in a way that did not need to be spoken, was no longer his alone. The coin remained on the table, catching none of the light, holding no value in the quiet that followed, and somewhere beyond the horizon, where the riders had gone, the land stretched on, unchanged, while here, in the stillness of that small house, something had shifted without sound, without force, without claim, and it stayed that way, steady, silent, and real.